On my kids. I've told these stories before, so they're in no way meant to embarrass them or anything. They've heard these stories, but just to tell you that we went through the same struggles that probably you guys did with your kids. And I remember at a time when my wife called me. This is always a telltale sign, right? When she calls you at work and answer the phone and she goes, "You need to come home. Your child is, it's my child now. Okay, I got it." And so I come home and we've done all kinds of different models of school. We've done university model school. We've done Christian private school at the beginning. And then for most of their schooling, my wife has homeschooled them and done some co-op stuff. And so it's been wonderful for us in our particular environment. And so this was a homeschool day, and she got to come home. And so said child is at the table, and I sit down. I come out of the most important meeting of my day or my week, but this is more important, family. And so I'm told my team at the church, "Hey, I got to go home, and I'll be back." And they're like, "Yeah, sure, no problem." I mean, I do the same thing and so go home, and said child is sitting at the table, and I sit down, and just walk in, very calm, I'm like, "Hey, how's it going today?" "Okay." I'm like, "Really? Your day's been good?" "Yeah, it's been good." I'm like, that's not what Mom told me." "Oh, well, yeah, maybe not." And I'm like, "Well, let me go catch up with Mom, and I'll be back, sitting." Normally, said child is not sitting at the table so perfectly, and she's just waiting for me to come home. So I go in. Huh? What? Did I? Dang it, I was really trying. Crap. Dang it. I was trying to watch my pronouns. So this means something totally different today. Anyway, so I was going back to the bedroom with my wife, and I was like, "Hey, so tell me the story." So I just catch up. I don't want to swoop in and kill the wrong person. You know what I mean? So bomb the wrong city. And so I go in, and she's like, "Well, it's just an attitude thing, and it's been happening for days, and it only comes out in these times." And I think we think it was some fear-based, some anxiety-based. Now looking back on certain things, and we're like, "Okay," but we're still trying to understand it. Okay, great. And so I walk in and sit down at the table and say, "Okay, well, we need to," and again, please do not misunderstand my stories as prescriptive. They are not prescriptive. They are for sure descriptive of the way that we chose to do them at the time, right? And so sit down at the table, talk. "Okay, well, hey, I love you." "Yes, I love you." "Okay." I said, "But you need to also know something. I am at war." "What?" I said, "I am at war." She goes, "With who?" And I said, "With your attitude." And she goes, "Okay." And I said, "Not with you. I love you. Right? Okay. With your attitude." She's like, "Okay." I said, "We've been talking about your attitude for a long time." Yeah. "I am at war with your attitude." She goes, "Okay." And I said, "I only need you to know one more thing. I will win this war." And she said, "Okay." And I wish I could tell you like that was the final conversation. She transcended to angelic status after that, and everything was fine. No, it wasn't. But there was some big changes and steps that happened, right? And so I think we made tons of mistakes, and still before that and after that and still today and tomorrow, I'm sure. But we did try to distinguish between the person and the decisions, or the person and the actions, the person and the attitude. And she understood. I loved her. Nothing was going to change that. Even her actions weren't going to separate our relationship, right? And we're going to come to that in just a second. But just to say, hey, we've got some issues here, and I want to define what the issues are. I want to make sure you and I are on the same page, right? So clarity, if you're in your business, you're in your home, you run your own side hustle, whatever you do, right? You know that if you can't clarify a goal, if you can't specify a goal, you have almost no hope of meeting that goal. If you can't specify it, you can't reach it. And the biggest and most famous leadership people will tell you that. And I think this is important in parenting too. So this is what we've been talking about, and we come now to goal. What is the goal of parenting? I would suggest to you that the goal of parenting for many people is something funny to me. It's like, well, I want to produce happy kids. And I'm like, okay, happy how? Because I know a lot of really awful happy people, you know? Or I want to produce successful people. Or I want to produce, my favorite is well-adjusted kids. I'm like, what the heck does that mean? What does well-adjusted mean? Well-adjusted to what? The room temperature or the culture or what? Like well-adjusted, happy kids, successful kids, whatever. I'm like, that's not good enough. That's not good enough because, again, I know a lot of pagans that are happy. I know a lot of really evil people that seem well-adjusted. Like, that's just not good enough for Christians. I don't think the church should want to produce happier, successful, or well-adjusted kids as a goal. So what is our goal? Well, I would suggest to you, let's try on for size, that the goal of parenting is to make disciples. Because that's what the Great Commission is. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. And we think of that as someone outside of our house, typically, and we think of discipling our kids only rarely. We think of establishing habits and spiritual disciplines and etc. for them, but we often don't view our goal of parenting as making disciples. And I would suggest that that's probably the most important, because this is what Paul David Tripp says. He says, hey, parenting is not a behavioral control mission. It's a heart rescue mission. And so when we begin to view the goal of parenting as they act in a certain way, and if they act in a certain way for a certain percentage of the time, then I'm a successful parent, right? I would imagine and assume that you've been around enough people to know a couple of things, that legalistic, we're going to get to that in the next section, sort of really harsh, heavy-handed, legalistic parents tend to produce obedient kids in the short term and estranged kids in the long term. Because kids know it is oppressive living under you, I'm just waiting until I don't, and then I'm out. We know some kids like that in families, and they're like, I obeyed my parents, I did all their rules, but as soon as I was able to go, I'm out, and I'm not ever really coming back. And so short term is probably not the goal that we see in the model of the Father. It's not what I don't think stewards do. We have to keep the long term in mind. And so making disciples, again, is not just about obedience. Obedience has its place. We're going to get to that. Obedience is very, very important, but it is about rescuing a heart. And so we were talking with Sarah in the break. And here's the important thing about this idea of stewardship. Sarah gets all the credit for this, so she gets a footnote. A steward as a parent, right? A parent is working with a child, parenting and discipling a child. A steward always has the real owner standing behind them. So if you can see God standing behind you, and then you as the parent working with the child. An owner has nobody standing behind him, right? The owner is just like, it's me. I'm up against the wall. It all stops here. So there's a difference. But if you look at that stewardship idea, what has God entrusted us with? And here's the real thing. If we want to make disciples, that's our goal. We want our children to be conscious of God. We want our kids to be obedient to God. We want our kids to be submissive of God. We want our kids to love God, to worship God, to trust God. How do they do that to an invisible being when they're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5? How do they learn how to do that in those most formative years of their growth? Well, they do that by learning to do all those things to the steward. They learn to, and you need to understand this, a child will learn God's submission by learning parent submission. A child will learn how to trust God by learning to trust you. And that's the tricky part about parenting is we don't do it perfectly. We don't do it perfectly like God does it perfectly. And so I met a couple years ago. We started talking to them about parenting, and they were talking about a mistake they made of parenting. They discovered it, and I said, "Well, what'd you do?" And they were like, "Well, we don't apologize to our kids." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, we've never apologized, never asked forgiveness to our kids." And I was like, "Why?" And they were like, "Well, we think that may disrupt their obedience, their trust in us, and we just don't want to." And I was like, "Oh, wow, okay." I didn't have the kind of relationship to go, "Well, this is what I would have wanted or should have asked." I said, "Just time out. Do you want your kids to learn how to ask for forgiveness?" Their answer would have been, "Of course." And then my second question would have been, "Well, then who are they supposed to learn that from?" And I got to tell you, we have done this so many times. I've sat with tears in my eyes many times, and in front of both of my children, and my wife even more, but both of my children, and said, "Listen, I responded out of anger. I responded poorly. I made a poor choice. I should not have done that, and I hurt you. And I need you to forgive." I'm asking you to forgive me, because that was not what I should have done. That's not what a good parent should do. Because I want them to know how to do that, and I want them to know that I'm not perfect, nor do I pretend that I'm perfect, okay? And that's how you make a disciple. You teach them and show them and model for them how to go. So it's important to understand that if we want our kids to obey God, they must learn how to obey us. That's the easiest route for them. There are other routes, they're just way harder, okay? If a child doesn't learn how to obey his parent or respect her parent, they can eventually learn how to obey and respect God. Just the route tends to be a little longer and more difficult. They tend to have to go down and get into trouble more. And then God, by his grace, unless God's grace rescues them from that, and then God, by his grace, pulls them out of that, and they realize, oh, trust and submission and obedience and worship and intimacy is really important with God. So they can learn it. But the easiest route is to learn how to do it with you. And that's what making disciples is really all about. And so let's talk about, we're going to get to this in a second, but there are at least 4 key challenges, I think, in the home. And what we're going to see in just a second is that the biggest problem is not what we think that it is. So if you're thinking about, okay, I'm just drawing a line around my parenting and my kids and everything, and some of you have 6, some of you have 1, some of you have multiples, right? And so let me say also that some of you, and I should have said this up front, I've thought it, this is not like an epiphany to me. Some of you, many of you, and many of your friends have a more difficult time with parenting than some. It is not all equal, okay? And so if you have adoptive or fostered kids, that can add layers of difficulty that are really complex, okay? If you have special needs in your kids or in yourself, that can add layers of complexity that are very difficult to manage. I get it. If you have any sort of significant trauma that you didn't cause or welcome, but that has invaded your home and your kids, that can cause layers of complexity that are very difficult to manage. And so we do not play equally in the parenting game, okay? And so I do not ever intend or mean to simplify it to you. So you're sitting there going, Scott, you have no freaking clue what it's like in my home, right? And I don't, okay? And I'm not pretending to. I am not some guru that's got it all together. and I'm here to just sprinkle fairy dust of wisdom on you and hope your life gets magically better. That's not what I'm trying to do. Trying to have an honest conversation from street level, right next to you, shoulder to shoulder, so that we can figure some of this stuff out. But the goal, just try it on. Rather than having well-adjusted kids or happy kids or successful kids, or just get them to their 18th birthday like my friend and then put your hands up in the air and walk away, throw keys to a car at them and a couple of suitcases and go, best luck, call me at Christmas, whatever. Those are just not good enough. Those are not good enough. Making disciples is, I think, a better goal. Try it on for size, see what happens. Let's get to strategy, because this is where it all comes together, and we're going to slow down here, okay? Strategy. 7 signs your strategy might be a problem. Your current strategy, okay? Let's just talk about these. Number 1, parenting for you is mostly about negotiation. Hey, okay, listen, if you go to bed, I'll do this. Just let's be honest with me, okay? We can do it Indiana Jones style if you want, right? I put my hand on it, you put your hand on it, we let go at the same time, all right? And so if you just do this, then I will do this, okay? Hey, if we go to the, would you stop crying if I give you a Twizzler? Just 1? Maybe 2? If I give you 2, would you do it? Okay, is it a deal, right? Negotiation is a tactic, but if it's mostly about negotiation, maybe your strategy is not a good one. These get hard. Try not to read ahead. I know you've all read them all already, but I should have said that up front. You love your kids, but you don't like them very much secretly. That's really a problem. Listen, I know at times you're like, I am so frustrated. I don't feel close to that child. I know I'm a father. I know I'm a mother, and I love them. I do. I would do anything for them, but right now, I just want to be away from them. I want them to go away for the weekend, or better, a week, and I don't want to see them or hear from them for a while. And if that just gets longer and longer, and you're like, I don't like being with you, then that's honest, and we should appreciate and approach that reality. But if that gets larger, then maybe your strategy is not really working. Your kids dictate most of your family decisions. Where are we going to go eat tonight? Well, we can't. Okay, I guess it's Arby's again, because that's the only place that, okay. But if they dictate everything, like what are we going to do on vacation? Or can we go here? Can we do that? Hey, let's be spontaneous and do this. And the kid's like, oh, wait a second. You've noticed some families, and maybe even you, we did this a little bit growing in early, because it happens. You have this new human being, right? And at least those first 24 hours, first 48, first 2 weeks, your whole life is like orbiting around that child, right? Again, you're just like, well, I just want to keep it alive. Like, I've been entrusted. I can't fail at that, And like, they didn't give me a manual or anything. They just sent me home with a bill. And I'm like, okay, wow. And so you're sort of rotating around. Like, everything revolves around this child. And I get it. But at some point, we have to change the gravitational orbit, right? We want the children to orbit around not the parent, but the family. We want everybody to have their own place, and no one person is in the middle. And so if one person or a couple of peoples are in the middle, even if it's just a egotistical, grumpy father, right? The father shouldn't be in the middle of the family. The married couple shouldn't be in the middle. They should have a greater gravitational pull than the children do, because they are the parents, and you're supposed to. But again, we need to develop a better system. And if we just all are rotating and orbiting around one kid or a couple of kids, that's not a good sign. In your home, doing gets way more attention than being. We'll talk about that. It's just like, man, wouldn't you do that? Why didn't you do that? I should have done that. You should have done that. And instead of just saying, hey, we love being together. Let's just do something where there is no doing, just being. I just said do something where there is no doing. That doesn't make any sense. Exhaustion far exceeds joy, and has for a long time. I mean, that's not difficult to approach, right? I'm just exhausted. Children have negatively affected your marriage. You look at each other, and I get it. Hey, listen, man, you enter especially if you had some of those beautiful years when you got married before you had kids, and you're like, this is amazing. We could stay up. We can go to France if we want to on a whim. We can do what, if you can afford it. We couldn't afford it. But if you can do this, you can do that. And all of a sudden your kids, you're like, man, we don't need a house sitter anymore. We need like a babysitter, and it's different than a dog sitter. And now so I know it changes. But if after years you look at your spouse and you're like, man, I don't think I like you anymore because your parenting is way different than mine, and we seem to fight over the kids. Like, I want to respond this way, you want to respond this way, and it's just pushing you apart. That's a sign, a warning sign your strategy is probably a problem. And the biggest one is your kids aren't close to you, they just are edging out. Not in freedom and independence, we want that, but they're edging out in intimacy and relationship. They're becoming fearful, they're becoming distant, they're becoming secretive. That's a really big warning sign, is when your kids start amassing all these secrets. Secret friends, secret communication, secret clothes, secret hobbies, secret activities. Like, that's really a bad sign that your strategy isn't good, okay? So, what about a strategy? Well, again, I want to go back to our model, our calling, and our goal, especially our model, and I want to say, what is God's strategy with us? What is God's strategy with me? How does he interact with me as a father? There are lots of things involved, right? Okay, there is law. There is obedience. There is repentance. There is, confession. There is also relationship. There is security. There's intimacy. There's joy. There's freedom. Okay. But when Jesus comes to fulfill God's interactive parenting strategy, or at least incarnate it fully, he seems to suggest, as does the rest of the New Testament, as I will suggest to you, that grace is the strategy that God uses to interact with us. That grace is God's strategy. Now, I've taught this enough to probably predict what you're thinking right now. Wait, what? You want a grace strategy for parenting. Does that just mean we just let things go? We just forgive everything? And let me answer that question with a question. Is that how God relates to you right now? No. We have a relationship with God by faith in Jesus that is secure. But every decision we make still has consequences within that relationship, right? Every sin we commit does have a consequence now, even though the eternal consequences of that have been paid for by Jesus. We still have, we read it first, God disciplines his sons and daughters when they step out of line. And so a grace-based system is not just free for all. We see the law was given through Moses. We just read that, grace and truth are realized through Jesus. We'll come back to this. But he chooses grace over fear and control. We're going to talk about some other options here. Because there are several other options that are typically related to law. Now, let's do some theological work for just a second, okay? I need you to think biblically with me and ask some honest questions, all right? And so, as I said, God relates to his people not just intimately and directly, but he also drives these stakes in the ground of covenants. And covenants are really important with how God interacts with his people, okay? And so we may have a covenant in Eden, although it doesn't have the strict form of a covenant. By far, we get a clear covenant when it comes to Noah, the Noahic covenant. I will no longer destroy the earth with water. Every covenant has a sign. And a rainbow sounds like a cool sign, but until you realize that there is, nearly universal death in the flood, and the rainbow is a archer's bow that's been put on a wall. It's a weapon that's been put on the walls, and God saying, I am no longer going to hold it in my hand to use it. So yes, it's a beautiful rainbow, and we have it in our nurseries, and we should teach the story in our kids, but it is a really, really difficult story, okay? And the sign is, I just destroyed the earth with water, except 6 people. And this is a weapon. It's a bow that God used, and I'm going to put that bow on the wall, and I'm going to not pick it up anymore. That's the sign. Every covenant has a sign. So we get to the Abrahamic covenant. I'm going to choose you from all the people in the earth. Let's start with you. Joshua 24 says that when God called Abraham, he was in Ur of the Chaldees. He was an idol worshiper, he and his family. Terah is his father, and Nahor and Haran were his brothers. Abram is probably not the oldest of the sons. And God chooses him, and he says, establishes a covenant in chapter 12 of Genesis, and chapter 15 and chapter 17. And the sign of that is circumcision. And so, you are my people. It's unconditional covenant. It's really covenant of grant. I wish we had time to do that. But this is not a theological conference. And so he establishes this to his people. You can't get out of this covenant, right? And this is, I guess that's not the point. But it is not dependent on you. Hundreds of years later, a long time later, we get the Mosaic covenant. I was trying to get to the actual dates there. We get to the Mosaic covenant around 1446 or so BC. And the Mosaic covenant is conditional. Do this, and you have access to me. What is the sign of the Mosaic covenant? Because every covenant has a sign. The sign of the Davidic covenant to David is there will be a person of David on the throne forever. The sign of the new covenant is the Spirit. What's the sign of the Mosaic covenant? Let me ask you another question to help you. What does Jesus get in trouble most over in the Gospels when it comes to interaction with the Pharisees, who are all about Moses and the Mosaic covenant? The Sabbath. The Sabbath, Exodus chapter 31, the Sabbath is the sign of the Mosaic covenant. And that's why Jesus gets in so much trouble with the Sabbath when he's interacting with the Pharisees, okay? And so the Mosaic covenant drops into this unconditional relationship and says, now you have some conditional things. Now let me ask you the most important question of the later New Testament. What was the original purpose of the Mosaic law? More importantly, how did Jesus interact and say he interacted with the Mosaic law? And what did the early church decide about the Mosaic law after Jesus died, was raised, and ascended? Was the purpose of the Mosaic law to save Israel? I would say no, because they were already a redeemed people. They had come out of Egypt, passing literally under the blood of the Lamb. God calls them my people the whole time. And he says, this is how my people are going to approach me. So it wasn't about salvation. What was the purpose of the Mosaic law? All of this is important to parenting, I promise. Because for us, analogous to the Mosaic law to Israel is like strict obedience in the home. And if we unconsciously or consciously make that connection poorly, then our obedience understanding in the home is going to be off as Christians, okay? And so what was the purpose of the law? Well, Jesus would say it clearly, and the rest of the New Testament, and Paul would say it. Paul said in Acts 13 and 14, he goes on his first missionary journey. Paul's in Pisidian Antioch, modern-day Turkey, and he's preaching to the men of Israel there. And he says in 13, 38, and 39, he says, Jesus came to give us forgiveness of our sins and freedom into a life of things that the law of Moses could not free us from. Galatians, Paul says, if righteousness would come by the law, then Jesus didn't need to come. He would say in Romans, that chapter 5, verse 20, the law was added so that sin would, what? Increase. And I read that, go, what? Record scratch. Huh? Sin would increase? He's like, yes, because not only does the law show us our guilt and sinfulness. At the same time, it reveals God's holiness and character. And we are understanding by the Mosaic Law, you cannot approach God commonly. You cannot approach God willy-nilly. He is holy and righteous, and you have to offer these sacrifices to even approach him because he is so holy and I am so not holy, okay? And then the third thing, God's character and holiness, my sinfulness, the third thing is really the most important, is that after a while, people begin to think, is this the way we always have to live? Is there ever going to be a sacrifice good enough to perfectly cover over my sinfulness, like once and for all? Jewish rabbis will tell you that have trusted in Jesus as the Messiah, and I've read them and they're brilliant. He said, the three of them said that I read, God did not bring his people to the law of Moses. He said God brought his people through the law of Moses and pointed them to the Messiah. So the law reveals God's character, reveals our sinfulness, and points us to the Messiah, Jesus. If that's how God treated obedience then, shouldn't that be how we treat obedience now? Let's be clear. The Mosaic Law is not just 10 commandments. It starts in Exodus 19, goes most of the rest of the book of Exodus, all of the book of Leviticus, half of the book of Numbers, and is repeated in the whole of the book of Deuteronomy. 3.5 books of the Pentateuch contain the law. Hundreds of individual sundry laws and all kinds of ceremonial things. Right in the middle, Leviticus, not coming after, not like coming 100 years after and God scratching his head, well, that didn't work. Right in the middle, he says, do all of these things. Next chapter, here's how you make up for it when you fail. Consider that. The law came with an expectation of unfulfillment. The law came with an expectation of imperfectly following God's law. It was built in. Because the point, again, is not to save people, not to redeem people, but to reveal holiness, sinfulness, and the Messiah. And if that's the case, then in our home, obedience must not be a way to earn a place in the family. But obedience must be a way to say, hey, listen, I need you to understand certain things about holiness. I need you to understand your own sinfulness. And I need you to reach out because of those things to Jesus. Let me ask you a question. Just a thought question. What is the most dangerous scenario you can imagine for your children? Just think about it for a second. All restrictions off. The most dangerous scenario for your children. I would often think of something like really catastrophic, something in the movies are like 60 Minutes, 2020 kind of things, right? They get kidnapped by a cult and they're doing all this or whatever, and or like Liam Neeson Taken. I don't want to have to go Liam Neeson on somebody if this terrible eventuality happens. Those are all really bad. But in many ways, those are temporary. What about this? What about your child growing up never understanding their need for a Savior? Because that has eternal consequences, I think that might be the most dangerous and horrific thing that can happen to your kids. And I would suspect, as I was first asked that question by somebody else, that you didn't think of that, because I didn't. I kept thinking about temporal things. I kept thinking, I don't want them to do that. Marry someone, or have a failed marriage, or have this, or go through infertility, or go through suffering, or get an incurable disease, or all these terrible, terrible, terrible things, but that are all temporary, temporal. I didn't think of eternal things. And so if that's true, and I think it ostensibly is true, that is probably the worst thing that can happen to our kids. What is our role in that? Well, I give it to you clearly. You cannot trust in Jesus for your kids. You can try. It ain't going to ever work. You can't believe for them. You can't obey for them. All you can do is model what those things look like. and live vulnerably, live transparently, and say, I want to treat you in the same way that the Father has treated me and treats me. So I'll boil it down for you, because the other law-based things, if we take the Mosaic law, transfer it into our home, and then color it over with, paper mache and craft stuff, and say, this is how we're going to approach the strategy of parenting, it can quickly become either a fear-based strategy, you do this or else, a shame-based strategy, I can't believe you did that. Or a control. You do it because I said you did to do it. Now again, there are times to probably say those things that I just said. Those are all, at least at some point, within bounds, because God kind of says those things. But if that's the only thing we say, if that just reinforces the strategy of fear, shame, or control, then those are bad strategies, because those are not the strategies that God uses with us. And so, again, there's lots of folks who are like, hey, I don't get it. Okay, look at this. Titus 2, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. And we're like, wow, yes, that's what the grace of God does. See, the grace of God is a free gift without any regard for the worth of the receiver, only by the beauty of the giver. And he says, God does, and it's very risky on his part, I might add, I'm going to gift you salvation and forgiveness and redemption and reconciliation and adoption and the fullness of the Spirit and all the things that happen when you trust in Jesus. That's the only requirement, your faith in Jesus. Because you can't solve your own sin problem, only he can. You put your faith in Jesus, and I gift you all of these things. And we say, that's God's grace. And at salvation, we say, thank you for God's grace. Thank you for your grace, God. And we put that on the shelf, and we say, oh, look, I was saved by grace. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that good? And we keep walking. We're like, oh, it's right over there. I was saved by grace when I was 18. I was saved by grace at 22. And oh, it's beautiful. And what we don't understand is that grace is still operative. Look at what it says in Titus 2. Bringing salvation to all men, second word. Next word, instructing us to deny ungodliness and to do all of these. See, grace is not just this gift of salvation. Grace is our teacher and instructor. And that's why and how grace is the strategy for the Father. So, as the Father shepherds you, he chooses grace over fear and control. Now, let's talk about the D word, discipline. Because we've already established in Hebrews 12 and many other places that God disciplines his children. So how are you supposed to do that? Let me start by saying that each child is very different when it comes to discipline. Each child responds to discipline very differently. So I had one child that you just had to speak to and harshly, and they would well up with tears, and they would, sort of snap into our expectation of obedience. We had another child who's kind of like, what? Like we would try this, try that, and we're like, yeah, what else you got? And so it was just very different. We only have 2 kids. It was very, very different for both of them. And so we had to really experiment with the way that we approached discipline. Discipline is important because, again, that's the way the Father interacts with us. But here's I want to try to get to this. Okay, yeah. Grace is the face that love wears when it meets imperfection. How's that for a quote? Ooh, that's good. That's my friend Dave. He lives in Colorado, and that's one that stopped me in my tracks over the last couple of years. I just ran into that a couple years ago. And it just, I can see the face of the Father when I hear this quote. But what I want to get to is this. Yes, here we go. This is what I want to boil it down to, 3 words for you. You take the model, and the calling, and the goal, and the strategy, And I want to put it together for you in this thing called Grace-Based Parenting. Again, to not completely from Tim Kimmel, but the same title as his book. And to say that the way that we interact is this: authority inside of security. And here's what I mean by that, okay? And so you watched movies. I love a very strange movie that nobody else loved. It's by the Wachowski brothers. They made The Matrix, but they also did a Speed Racer movie that was kind of based on a lot of the Asian comics and the TV series and stuff. I think it's absolutely genius, and I love it, and I watch it just to make myself smile. Nobody else really did, but anyway, there's the father. The Racer family father. One son leaves and he says this. He goes, I tell you the truth, if you walk out that door, you better never walk back in because you're not welcome, right? And the son leaves, and it's this big storyline. Well, another son, many, many years later, is walking to the same door, and Rex Racer goes, hey, son, can I have a conversation with you before you leave? And he comes up and he goes, I'm not going to try to talk you out of walking out. I just want to tell you this. I love you. And I'm sorry for all the things that led up to this. And you may choose to walk out that door, but I need you to know that anytime and anywhere in any condition you ever want to come back, that door will be open and we will be here for you. And that's really the backbone of the whole movie, is he treated one son differently and he learned from it, and he treats the other son in this way. And I see the father doing the second son, not the first, right? You are my son by faith. You are my daughter by faith. I tell you, you may choose to walk out that door. You may choose to disobey me. You may choose to do the things that I don't want you to. And I can't tell you there won't be consequences to those, but I can tell you this. If you ever turn around and come to your senses because you want to feed your stomach with the slop that the pigs are eating, and you come back, I'll be waiting. And in Luke 15, the father figure in the prodigal son story does something as a picture of God that God never does anywhere else in the scriptures. Not once. Do you know what it is? He runs. He runs down the road to meet the child. And an avatar of God in any of the parables or stories or anthropomorphisms in the Old or New Testament, God never does that, not once. Which means that he's leaning against the pillar of his, ranch-style Jewish home, and he's looking down the road to the gate, and he's waiting every day. He's waiting every day. Because he says, when he was still a long way off, he saw him and he ran to him. That's this security piece. I am always going to be your father. No matter what happens, I'm always going to be your father. You're always going to be my daughter and son. Now, inside of that secure relationship, let's talk about authority. Because I am the authority. You are not. And now as parents, we say the way you learn to submit to authority, as we've already established, is the way that you're going to learn to submit to God's authority. And so discipline will be important. I told you the 3 things that I think you should discipline for, and particularly only those 3 things. Because as Tim Kimmel says, there should be 4 freedoms in your home. The freedom to make mistakes, the freedom to be candid, the freedom to be vulnerable, the freedom to be different. I don't know if you've ever done this, but when our kids were little, sometimes they would knock something off the table and it would spill, right? And they would look at, I'm so sorry. And that was a time in our best moments when we were walking in the Spirit in that moment, we would be like, hey, it's just an accident. Like, you didn't do that on purpose, did you? You didn't throw your food on the floor. Like, no, I just hit it. And it's this beautiful holy moment for you to go, hey, I make mistakes all the time too. Would you help me clean it up? It's no problem. We'll get it for you, right? And so, whoa, all of a sudden the kid knows, oh, I'm free to make mistakes. Now, freedom to be candid. Hey, can I say what I'm thinking? Yeah, for sure. As long as it's not disrespectful, disobedient, or dishonest, you can be candid. Yeah, for sure. And you can be different. you don't have to like what I like. You don't have to like the movies that I like. You don't have to like camping if I like camping. But if we decide to do this, if we decide to eat this for a family meal, then I'm going to expect you to eat it. I'm not a short order cook. I can't make what you want and what you want and what you want and what you want. I'm not going to do that. And so we're going to eat this together, but you don't have to like it. Yeah, you can be different. It's freedom. And you're not lesser if you are. You can be free. You can be vulnerable. You can share. You can be candid. You can make mistakes. But inside of the security, I want to enforce, and I use that word, cautiously, in a holy, righteous way. I want to enforce discipline when it comes to disobedience. If I say something and you disobey, disrespect. If you ever approach me in a disrespectful way, you speak to me disrespectfully, or if you're dishonest, especially dishonest, lying to a parent, lying to a peer is a really bad sign as a kid, really bad sign. And you may think that that's sort of inherent, and sometimes it is because they're testing the waters as a kid. Who dumped all of this talcum powder all over the train set table to make it snow? Oh, I have no idea. It wasn't me. Wasn't me. Really? It wasn't you? No, it wasn't me. So there is this experimentation with kids, with the truth. It's like, can I get out of this, right? You've probably seen on social media, so like the M&M challenge, where they put the things on the M&Ms on the table. They set up a little phone and they say, hey, listen, you can have all of these M&Ms, but you can't do it until I come back. Like, I'm going to go. It's just like this social experiment with kids. And some kids wait, and some sisters are like, no, wait. And some of them just eat them all immediately. And then you come back, what happened? I don't know. And it's like dripping out. I don't know what happened, And so they do experiment with the truth. And hopefully you can discern between that experimentation phase and when they're actually beyond that phase into sort of concrete dishonesty. There is a difference. But discipline must come down to those three things in particular. And let me suggest this, that when you don't discipline, even in some small way, for those things tend to grow and expand. I can remember one, again, these are not prescriptive stories, they're just descriptive of what we've done and maybe some of the mistakes we've made. My son is a man. I'm trying to teach him all kinds of things. He's almost 19, right? He's a young man, and we're talking about all kinds of kinds of things. He was much, much younger, and he was disrespectful to my wife. And I came home, and it was just a spur-of-the-moment kind of tactic. I'm not sure if it was a good tactic or whatever, but I had a conversation with him, and I tend to have those conversations, very calmly. I want to take my voice down. I want to sit across from them, not as they're equal so much, but I'm reasoning with them. I want to be very, very clear. I don't want to just come in full of emotions and respond with heat. I want to have light and heat, right? And so, hey, Mom told me that you were very disrespectful to her. What did I do? Well, this is what she told me that you did. That you yelled or you barked, kind of, and did you do that? Yeah, I guess I did. Okay. Well, I want you to know, that's my wife you're talking to. And he goes, huh? I was like, that's my wife you're talking to. And I said, and as a husband, nobody disrespects my wife. He was like, okay. And I was like, so I'm telling you now, don't do that again. Okay. Because if you're disrespectful to my wife, I'm going to have to step in, and there will be consequences to that. Just like there would be consequences to anyone else in this world who was disrespectful to my wife. Okay, very good. And then I said, and also, she's your mom, and she deserves respect. And so you are not to ever be disrespectful. You can share your thoughts, you can complain, but you need to do that with respect. Understood? Great, understood. Okay, and again, I'd like to tell you, paint the picture that these simple little Scott conversations just solved all the conflict in our home. That's not true, obviously, but try to tell you to approach. Sometimes you have to come in hot. Sometimes you have to come in hot. And I would want to say that For us, again, every child is different, but I think that physical contact, swatting, spanking, whatever you call it, should be on the table for you, not as an unholy, unchristian kind of thing, but you need to do that carefully, all right? Words are often, enough, often. As long as you're clear, calm your voice down, speak to them. Again, this is not about reasoning with a child, because there is no reasoning with a 2-year-old, right? So let's go back to the airport, walking around this. Or the guy with the, and then he just totally breaks character and goes back to whatever he's doing and doing his kids. So if you're in one of those situations, discipline could look like this. Today, tomorrow, you could get together, you and your spouse, you could sit your kids down and go, you know what? How about this for a conversation? You could say, man, we've been really thinking about our parenting in our home. And I want to tell you, we want to make some changes. We're going to make some changes. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to do this a little differently. And we're going to do that a little differently. We've got to be very specific and very clear. You don't want to have 18 things, maybe 3 things, maybe 4 things. And I just want to let you know right up front, very clear. This is how we want to do it. We're not going to be perfect at it. You're not going to be perfect at it. There may be a time of adjustment, but we want to change our home. We want to change the way we do things. This is how we're going to do it. So be clear. You communicate terms. And then you say, okay, and so then the next time somebody wobbles or disobeys those terms, you meet it with consequences and discipline. Often just words. Sometimes physical touch. I think that should be, in rare cases where it's intended and needed, but you can take things away. You can ground. I think all of these very common options should be on the table. Grounding and taking things away is called extinction, right? So you take something away. Never food, never time with you, that kind of thing, right? We don't take away food or starve children or take meals away and excessively. That's not a good idea to do. They may have different food. They may not get their favorite thing, right? But we need to feed and water our kids, okay? If we feed and water our dogs, we need to feed and water our kids all the time. Please don't do that. But you can take certain things away. Even my kids now is older teen. I mean, we call them young adults. We say, hey, phone. And they're like, this is my phone. I'm like, yeah, but you live under my roof. I pay the phone bill. That's mine, Even headphones. I bought these headphones. Don't care. You're in my house. This is my domain, right? And I need those for 24 hours, for 48 hours. I need this or that. Why? Because this is what consequences do. This is important to realize. And I've told this to my kids forever. I said, consequences are a reminder. A reminder of what? A reminder of what you broke. You broke trust. You broke a rule. You broke respect. And I need you to remember that. And so every time you want to reach for your phone and it's not there, because I have it, you remember, I was disobedient. Disrespectful. I was dishonest. And so consequences are a reminder. And when we see them like that, then it's important to understand. So discipline must take place in a home. An undisciplined home would be a really rough place to parent and a really rough place to be a kid. And so as we close, think of a couple things and we'll have some question and answer. Brene Brown, you may be familiar with her. She's from, I think, University of Houston. She's maybe a Catholic Christian. She's wonderful. She's all over her YouTube and everything. She talks mostly about shame and vulnerability. She's got some really great things to say. I think she teaches sociology or something like that, psychology at University of Houston, or did. And she tells this story. She says, every semester she would have, in this particular class, she would have this conversation. But it wasn't so much about the conversation as about what she observed. So she's playing sociologist or psychologist at the time. So she'll seed thought, a question in the class, and then step back and watch. And the question is this: tell me a story of the authority or the rules of your parents growing up, okay? And one of them will go, I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies. And they're like, somebody goes, oh, R-rated movies? I wasn't allowed to watch PG-13 movies. And then somebody will go, I wasn't even allowed to watch anything beyond a G, and so they're all trying to one-up each other. Yeah, my mom wouldn't let me go to Friends, and so this and that. But that's not what Professor Brown was watching. She was looking at the students who weren't involved in the conversation, because there's always a couple. And the conversation ends, she closed class, and then she'll follow one of those students. She'll go, can I ask you a question for a second? Okay? And she said, every time this happens. She says, why weren't you involved in the conversation about rules? And the student will invariably say, my parents didn't have many rules for me. And she will say, did you like that? And they will say, I liked it then, but I don't like it now. I realize now that that's what I was longing for. That's what I was longing for. And so Jordan Peterson says the same thing. He's a behavioral psychologist, Canadian. I really like a lot of the things he has to say about parenting. He's really wise. He's sharp because he kind of trained up that way. But he says that most parents fear over clamping down on their kids as a way of stifling creativity and individuality. And he says, but exactly the opposite is true. In all of our studies, exactly the opposite is true. He says, the most individualistic, the most free, the most creative, the most joyful kids come out of a home where there were boundaries and rules. And the opposite, when there were no boundaries or rules, we don't typically see creative, joyful, individual kids. The opposite is true. My friend Dr. Paul Looney said this to me, and we'll end on this and you have some question and answer. He's a medical doctor, psychiatrist, psychologist, pastor, counselor. He's just a Renaissance man. He said, Scott, every kid, no matter their age, is asking 2 questions of their parents. 2 questions. And they're related. Very simple questions. 1, every word in the question is important, okay? 1, do you really love me? And 2, what are you really made of? And let me explain that to you. Where is it? I'm going to put it in here somewhere. There we go. Kids are asking, do you really love me? What he means by that is, if I step out of line, will you still love me? And that's why some kids, even unconsciously or subconsciously, they walk up to the line and they cross it. You've probably seen it as a parent. They're like, hey, whatever you do in this room, don't touch that. And some kids will go right up to that and touch it and look at you. Because even subconsciously, they're saying, is my relationship with you based on obedience? If I touch this, will you stop loving me? Do you really, really love me? And you need to find a way to say, that does not serve the intimacy of our relationship when you disobey, but I will always love you and you will always be a member of my family. You'll always be my daughter, always be my son. But when you disobey, it interrupts the intimacy of that relationship. That's what God says. That's the difference between justification and sanctification. You are justified as a legal declaration. God says, you are my daughter and son by faith in Jesus. Now your sanctification goes up and down. And if you sin and run away from me, our intimacy is totally interrupted. But our relationship isn't. And so, do you really love me? Now the second one, what are you really made of? And that comes to this. If you tell me that you're going to do X if I do Y and I do Y, will you really do X? What are you really made of? And that's a trust question. The second question is a trust question and they're related, I told you. The first one, a kid is asking, how far will your love go? And the second question is, will I be able to trust you when it gets really bad? It makes me emotional because every kid is asking those questions. And the way that we answer those questions is not with words, one time. Yes, I really love you, and yes, I'll do what I say. You have to model it. You have to live it out over years and years. You have to say, no matter what you do, I'm always going to love you. I may not like you right now. Our intimacy may be impaired, but my love is there and constant. The most important time to hug a child is after you discipline them. Discipline a child. What you did is wrong, and it hurts my heart, and here's the discipline. You understand? Consequences are a reminder of what you did wrong. I need you to remember. You were dishonest, you were disobedient, whatever. You understand? Great. Come here and give me a hug. I love you. This hurts my heart. This hurts my heart. Now go to your room for 48 hours or whatever it is, you know? But I love you, and you can trust me to do what I say I'm going to do. When I talk to men about what it means biblically to lead their families, which is often very amorphous and nebulous, like lead your family, what does all that mean? They think mostly about leading devotionals with their kids and learning how to play guitar so they can sit on the fireplace hearth and lead everybody in worship or whatever it is. This is how I lead my family. Some of those are important, not the leading the guitar part, but I say the number one thing for men to lead their family is to be trustable. If you want your wife to trust you and have this biblical respect for you, you have to be a trustworthy man. You have to do what you say you're going to do and not do what you say you're not going to do. And as a parent, the same thing. If you promise, and how many times have I seen it in my friend circles and in airports or whatever, if you do that, I'm going to do this. And then the kid does that, and they don't do it. And the kid is saying, you don't do what you say you're going to do. Then how am I going to trust you when it gets really bad? This is just about candy. What if it's about life and death? What if it's about relationship? Am I going to be able to trust you then? And so as parents, we have to know, my kids are constantly asking these questions, and I have to prove to them, I will always be there for you, and you can trust me. You can trust me. And so that's a model and a calling and a goal and a strategy. And together, I would suggest there's a way forward for us that looks much more like God the Father in the Scriptures and Jesus, our Savior, than it does our culture, or that it does our home of origin, or that it does our church of origin, or that it does even some of the really popular books that you can read. I'm not suggesting I'm smarter or better than any of those men or women that write those books, but I just find some of them are just teaching tips and tricks. And whereas those are important, sometimes we need those, but I would like to drill down a little bit more and test the foundation of our house, right? And so those are just some of the things I think we can get to during this. So it's 12:02. I know I want to respect everybody's time, but if you have questions, I would love to engage more about questions. Thoughts, questions? Yes, tell me your name. Joey. Shoot, Joey.
So you talk about Jordan Peterson, and I read his book, 12 Rules for Life.
Uh-huh.
And I think in the book, he talks about, he mentions that to discipline your kids, you need to exert the minimum amount of force required to get the behavior that you want.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, that kind of sounds good on the surface, but also I'm like, I don't know that necessarily sounds super Christian.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't agree with everything Jordan Peterson has ever said or written, and so I'm not, just this blanket thing. And I don't know if Jordan was as close to Christian or as close to Jesus when he wrote that book as he is now, so you may go back on some of that stuff. But I've started that book. I haven't read that. I got to the lobsters first chapter, and then I put it down. And so, but I bought it, so I supported his ministry. And I bought the second one too. So, minimum amount of force to get that. Like in principle, I get what I understand what he's approaching, right? And that is that we don't want to engage in a war of annihilation if it doesn't require a war of annihilation, right? And so in theory, I agree with that. Now, in specific experience and and detail, yeah, maybe that's not going to always work for you. But what I think he's suggesting there, if I understand it correctly, is your discipline and consequences should meet not only your child's temperament and personality, but also what they did, right? And so, you're not going to burn down their clubhouse because they didn't finish their Brussels sprouts or something like that, right? And so, whereas if they were smuggling drugs with their friend Carlos down the street and hiding them in the clubhouse, I would burn it down, right? That's what I'm saying. And so, just to maybe meet the situation, but again, maybe I don't understand it. But I like Jordan a lot. He's been through it a lot. And I respect his sort of grit, but I wouldn't say wholesale I agree with everything he said. So I'll go back and read the book, Joey. I bought it. I should read it. So any other questions or thoughts? Yes, tell me your name.
Linda.
Sorry? Linda.
How do you go with discipline? Like I'm a stepmom,
Uh-huh.
but the kid lives with us.
Yes.
But his grandparents are really ownership because they
Ah.
really raised him until, well, they tried to raise him until now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like really hard for us to discipline him in our home. And whenever he's at grandma's, it's just,
I get it. Miss Linda, as I was telling you earlier about the layers of complexity. So blended families, super engaged grandparents or brothers and sisters, uncles and aunts. Yeah, that really complicates things because we have some people in our family who parented in a certain way, but they didn't have him on the weekends. And they went to the weekends and they got parenting that is completely different. And then they would come back and all the things would be undone. And they'd have to do it again. Like that's super hard, super complex. And so there is not an easy route to that. It's probably the hardest route is probably the best. And that is maybe your husband having a conversation with his parents. That's what I assume they're with, your husband's parents. Yeah, having a conversation with his parents and saying, hey, this is what Linda and I are trying to do in our home. And we are stewards of these kids. You don't own them. I know you raised them. And I thank you a billion times for all that you've done. Could you try to approach us and let's work together as a team on this parenting strategy? And this is what's important to us. And I need you to understand that. And maybe it can be important to you. Like that's the hardest thing, but it's the most direct route, right?
because my stepson, like he's 8, so he already knows like the discipline, like
Is different?
to have one over there.
Sure.
Here, it's just really hard. And then whenever my husband wants to discipline him, even whenever we're over there, I'm at in-laws, like they discipline my husband and not the kid.
Oh, wow. Oh, gosh. Okay.
Don't do that. We don't do that.
Yeah.
Or, and it's just hard. I think my husband is just kind of afraid of his parents too.
Sure.
So it's just a constant like battle.
Yeah.
I want my kids, well, he lives with us too, like to learn about God,
Mm-hmm.
the discipline, the school and everything. And with him it's different because he sees my kids, but it's like, like I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's many layers there, right? I'm so sorry. That's very complex. Treating different kids differently.
And I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
There's some point that I'm like, I can't keep fighting with the kid and the grandparents.
I hear you.
Whenever I'm trying to lead, and then there's this one, and then my kids are like, well, how come he doesn't go to church? Or how come he doesn't read the Bible? Or like
Yep.
little things, well, not little things. They're big,
Yeah, but I get it.
but it's just,
Gosh, I'm sorry. That's complicated. That's very, very complicated. I would say that your husband, I'm sure he's a great guy. He's not here. I don't know him. But whenever, this is one thing I want to constantly keep in my mind. When I make a fear-based decision about anything, that is not a good decision. So I really try to look at and I say that because it sounds like maybe your husband is saying, well, I don't want to step on toes. I don't want to do that, And those are fear-based decisions because sometimes the right route for us, the right path ahead is the hardest path ahead. It's having those really, really hard conversations with parents, with brothers, with children. And those are not easy, super complex. And in your position, yes, there are multiple layers of complexity. But what most people try to do, I don't know if it's just path of least resistance or whatever, but they try to approach it from the bottom up. Well, I work with this kid, and then I'll work with that kid, and we'll just try to climb our way back up to the top or the root of the problem. Whereas the better probably is to have multiple prong approach and to say, I need to talk to my husband, need to get on the same page, need to talk to his parents, need to get on the same page. At the same time, I try to lead my kids and bring all of our kids, step kids together to one family, make sure that, it's complex, I'm sorry. My goodness. Yes, very complex. Wow. I wish I had a silver bullet or a blue pill to give you. I don't have either one of those. So, yeah. Any other questions, Tricia? Yeah? No? Oh, okay. Yes, very good. That's good. That's good. Anything else? No? Let me say a prayer. Father, we bless you and thank you. We love your presence. We love the way that you lead and parent us. What a blessing it is, and what a challenge it is to try to appropriate some of those things, to try to approach the way that you do it so that we can do it better. I pray more than anything, Father, a heaping measure of your grace on these parents' lives and hearts, on their decision-making, on their fears, on all of the challenges, on their mistakes and failures, Father. Thank you, God, that you are bigger than our parenting decisions, that you are stronger than our mistakes, that your grace is super abundant beyond our failures and sin and weaknesses. And you promise something that is it's seemingly never more true than it is in parenting. That is that your grace is perfected in our weaknesses, that your grace is sufficient for us. Your power is perfected in our weaknesses. And so we confess, Father, as parents, we are weak. We do not know the answer. We are fleshly and responsive, and we get tired and angry and confused. And so, God, in all of those things, we ask that your power would be perfected, your grace would be sufficient, you would fill in all of the gaps, you would cover over all the mistakes, you would heal all the broken places, and that you would show up powerfully, starting right now today, in this next few days, in this week, in this month, and this year, in our home and among our kids like never before. We need you and trust you, and pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, I guess we start back here at 6. Is that right? 6 tonight for marriage stuff.